I still remember the first night I heard the story of the Blue Ridge Mountains in western North Carolina. The way the locals spoke about them in hushed tones, as if raising their voices too high might stir something awake among the ridges. And it was October 14th, 2017, when I was sitting in a small diner just outside Asheville nursing a cup of black coffee after a long drive from Raleigh, when a man named Henry Caldwell, a retired park ranger with a weathered face and a voice that carried both authority and fatigue, leaned across the booth and told me, "You think these mountains are quiet, son, but you don't know what they keep." And the way he said it felt less like a warning and more like a statement of fact, the kind of truth that people who spend their entire lives in one place hold deep in their bones. And at first I thought he meant the usual dangers like black bears, sudden storms, or hikers who wander off the Appalachian Trail and never return. But then he spoke of something older, something people never wrote down but whispered about in fragments, saying the Cherokee had long believed certain stretches of the Blue Ridge were thin places where the world we know rubs so close against something else that the boundary blurs. And he never once said supernatural. He only said the land had memory, and sometimes it remembered you back. And I didn't know then that his story would stop being a curious campfire tale and instead carve itself into me as sharply as the cliffs of Craggy Gardens. The more Henry spoke, the less the glossy brochures by the Register made sense, because he told me about 1913 when a survey crew vanished near Mount Mitchell, leaving only their equipment scattered across a clearing with no signs of struggle, and about a Baptist minister named Elias Foster, who in 1948 swore he heard his deceased wife's voice calling to him in the middle of Linville Gorge, which led him to wander for 2 days barefoot and incoherent before being found. And Henry said during his 37 years as a ranger, he had seen the same names and dates scratched into trail shelters decades apart, as if the mountains themselves were writing something only a few could read. And by the time I left the diner that night, the story had crawled under my skin so deeply that as I drove into the Blue Ridge the following morning, the October mist clinging to the valleys made me feel as though the forest itself were eavesdropping. I told myself it was just a hiking trip, just a week away from work to clear my head, and I had packed my tent, sleeping bag, trail map, and supplies. Nothing unusual. But when I reached the trailhead on October 15th, the ranger station was closed and the logbook outside was strangely empty. Only 2 names written in the last week, one from October 10th by a hiker from Charlotte and another from October 12th. Just the initials JD with no listed destination. And I remember pausing with the pen in my hand because it felt like writing my name there meant signing a contract I didn't fully understand. The air carrying a faint metallic tang, like the aftermath of lightning, even though the sky was perfectly clear, and still I signed and set off, not realizing that step was into a story far larger than mine. The first 2 days passed quietly, though not in any ordinary sense, because the silence itself felt alive. And camping along the ridge above Shining Rock Wilderness, I noticed how when the sun dropped, the forest seemed to press pause. No crickets, no owls, no rustle of small animals. Only stillness so sharp it filled my skull. And on the night of October 16th, I woke at 2 a.m. to what I thought was wind, a rushing sound outside my tent. But when I opened the flap, the trees were completely still, and the stars looked closer than they should have been. And I told myself I was exhausted and went back to sleep. But the next morning, I discovered a spiral shape carved into the soil at the edge of my camp, as wide as my hand. And I know I never made it, and no animal could have done it. So I photographed it with my phone, only to find later that the image was nothing but a gray blur, as though the lens had fogged, though it had not. From that moment, I could not shake the sensation of being watched. Not by eyes behind me, but by the weight of the air itself. And on October 17th, I seriously considered turning back, but Henry's words replayed in my head. The mountains remember you. And I felt that to leave would mean missing something meant for me to see. So I pressed on and camped that night near Glassmine Falls, where water roars nearly 800 feet down a cliff. And while I listened to its endless crash, I began to hear beneath it a rhythm, a pattern of voices woven with the cascade. And as I strained to listen, a mist rolled in without warning, thick and heavy, and my lantern flickered despite fresh batteries. and through the shifting fog I glimpsed figures along the ridge, tall and impossibly still, too much so to be hikers. And as quickly as I saw them, the mist swallowed them again, leaving me trembling with the knowledge that whatever this was had only just begun. By the morning of October 18th, the sense of being followed had become impossible to ignore, not in the ordinary way of footsteps behind me or the snap of a twig, but in the weight of the forest pressing down from every side, as though it were adjusting itself around me. And when I checked the trail map against the landmarks I had passed, something didn't add up, because according to the map, I should have been no more than 6 miles from the fork, near Black Balsam Knob, yet when I looked at the terrain, nothing matched. The ridgeline seemed shifted, the angles of the peaks slightly wrong, as if I were walking through a reflection of the place rather than the place itself, and I kept thinking of Henry's words about thin places where boundaries blur. That afternoon the weather shifted without warning, clouds rolling in fast and heavy, and the air grew so damp that every breath felt like swallowing fog, and I stopped to rest at what looked like an old campsite, the remains of a fire ring surrounded by moss, though the stones were worn smooth and half-buried, too ancient to belong to any recent camper, and etched faintly into one of them was the same spiral I had seen outside my tent, larger this time, stretching across half the rock. And when I touched it, the stone felt warm, almost pulsing. I pulled my hand back quickly and kept walking, but with every step, I felt the echo of that warmth in my palm, as though I carried a piece of the mountain's memory with me. By evening, I reached and overlooked that should have given me a view of Looking Glass Rock, yet the valley below was veiled in a dense white fog so thick I could see only the treetops poking through like islands in a pale sea. And within that fog, I thought I saw lights, not bright like flashlights, but faint and scattered, glowing with a kind of dull amber, as if lanterns were moving far below. And the strange thing was that they flickered in perfect unison, as though they shared a single rhythm. I stayed there longer than I should have, staring until the lights slowly faded one by one, until only the fog remained. That night, I set up camp reluctantly, my nerves stretched thin, and I barely slept, jolting awake at every sound. And once, just before dawn, I heard what I swear was a whisper directly beside my tent, a voice low and steady, speaking words I could not recognize. And when I shot upright and unzipped the flap, the clearing was empty, though the grass at the edge swayed as if someone had just stepped away. On October 19th, I tried to backtrack, certain now that something was wrong, but the trails betrayed me, splitting in directions not marked on the map and looping back on themselves. And by midday, I realized with a sinking dread that I had passed the same crooked birch tree 3 times, though I had been walking in what I thought was a straight line, and the marks I scratched into the bark with my knife to orient myself vanished when I circled back, as if the tree had healed itself. That evening, I stumbled upon a collapsed cabin, hidden deep in the woods, its roof caved in and timbers rotting, and inside I found rusted tools, shards of glass, and a tattered journal half buried beneath debris, its pages warped by dampness, yet still legible in places. The entries dated back to 1936 and were signed by a man named Thomas Radcliffe, who wrote of working a logging camp nearby. But the later entries grew erratic, speaking of the voices in the fog and the watchers on the ridge, and finally of a spiral carved into the hillside that pulled at the eyes until one could not look away. The last entry, dated November 12, 1936, ended mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted, and the page was smudged with a dark stain that looked too much like dried blood. I left the journal, where I found it, uneasy about carrying it with me, but the words clung to my mind as I pressed onward, the fog curling between the trees and hiding distances, so that I could never be sure how far I had traveled. By the night of October 20th, the forest had taken on a different character, not just silent, but resonant, as if every sound I made reverberated into something unseen. And when I knelt to drink from a stream, I noticed my reflection shimmering strangely, not in rhythm with the ripples, but lagging behind, as if it were delayed, my own face staring back at me a second too late, eyes wider and mouth parted, as if it knew something I did not. My skin crawled, and I staggered back, refusing to look again. But I could not shake the image of that delayed reflection. Later that night, I was awakened by the distinct sensation of someone walking around my camp, soft, deliberate steps that circled once, twice, then stopped directly behind my tent, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound, because I knew in my core that someone or something was standing there waiting. I held my breath until my chest ached, and when I finally dared to unzip the flap, nothing was there, though in the soil I found three spirals drawn side by side, each larger than they last, as if they were growing. October 21st was the day I stopped trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. The fog never lifted that morning, thick and endless, and as I trudged forward, I began to hear singing, faint at first, carried on the wind, a slow rising chant. Without words, voices blending so seamlessly, they sounded like a single note vibrating through the trees, and the deeper I went, the stronger it became, until the ground itself seemed to hum beneath my feet. I broke into a run, desperate to escape, but no matter how far I went, the chant remained, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always just out of reach. And when I finally collapsed against a fallen log, I realized the forest had gone utterly still again, the song vanishing as though it had never existed, leaving only the echo of it vibrating inside me. And I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move, certain that the mountains were drawing me deeper into something I no longer had the power to resist. October 22nd began with a sky so pale it seemed drained of color, and though the fog had thinned, I could not recognize anything around me, as if the forest had rearranged itself overnight. And by now I no longer believed I was lost in the ordinary sense, but caught in something older and deliberate, as though the mountains themselves had decided where I would walk that day. I came upon a clearing ringed by ancient oaks, their trunks twisted and scarred with symbols carved deep into the bark, spirals, lines intersecting circles that pulsed faintly when touched by the light. And in the center of the clearing was a depression in the ground lined with stones blackened, as if by fire, yet no ashes remained. And when I stood there, the air vibrated with the same low hum I had heard in the chants days before, rising and falling with the beat of my own pulse. I fled the clearing, my chest tight and my ears ringing, but no matter which way I turned, the sound followed me, threading itself into every gust of wind, every crack of a branch, until I felt it inside my bones. Later that afternoon, I reached a ridge overlooking a hollow, and there in the mist I saw figures again, clearer than before, not imagined shadows, but tall human shapes, standing in a wide circle, their heads tilted slightly back, their arms at their sides, as if listening to something I could not hear. And though I blinked repeatedly, they did not vanish this time. They only wavered slightly, like reflections in water, and I swear one of them turned its head toward me, though the distance was impossible, and in that instant the air grew unbearably heavy, forcing me to stumble back. And when I regained balance, the hollow below was empty, as if nothing had ever been there. That night my fear reached a breaking point. I did not pitch my tent, but sat against a boulder, clutching my pack, waiting for dawn. But around midnight the mist rose thick and sudden, and with it came the chant again, louder than ever, swelling from every side until it drowned out even the pounding of my own heart. And the spirals appeared around me, drawn into the earth, glowing faintly, as if lit from beneath, and I could see them spreading outward, locking me into a pattern that pulsed with light and rhythm. And then I saw them, not at the ridge, not distant, but standing only feet from me, the same tall figures, faceless, yet solid, their outlines shimmering with the fog. And though they made no move toward me, their presence pressed against me like a storm wind. And the chant did not come from their mouths, but from the ground itself, from the trees, the stones, the very air, trembling in unison. I shouted, though I don't remember what words tore from my throat, only that my voice was swallowed instantly, as if the mountains refused to let it out. I stumbled through the spirals, breaking the lines in the soil, and the glow dimmed for a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat the chant faltered, and I ran blindly, crashing through undergrowth, cutting my legs on rocks until my lungs burned. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I collapsed in another clearing, far smaller, and here I found something that froze me more than the figures had: a tree so old and massive its trunk split into three, and upon its bark dozens of names carved one over the other, layered so deeply some were almost unreadable, but a few stood out: Elias Foster, 1948; Thomas Radcliffe, 1936, and near the bottom Henry Caldwell, 1979, the same Henry who had spoken to me in that diner 2 days before seeing his name nearly 40 years earlier, made my blood run cold. And though the carving looked weathered with age, the lines of the letters were sharp, as if freshly cut. I staggered back from the tree, but tripped over a stone, and when I steadied myself, I saw the ground was covered with spirals, faint, but countless, stretching outward into the forest. As though everything I had seen was born from this very place, the chant returned, faint at first, then rising, and the mist coiled upward through the branches and in that swirling gray. I thought I saw faces, dozens, maybe hundreds, peering out, silent, watching, not hostile, but not kind, either, only waiting. And in that moment, I understood that the mountain was not showing me something from the past, or even the present, but something it had always held, something it always would hold. And whether I left or not, I was already written into it like the names on the tree. I pressed my hand against the bark, desperate to prove it was real, and when I did, the hum surged through me so violently I collapsed to my knees, my vision swimming, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw my own name etched faintly at the very bottom, half formed, as if waiting to be finished. I ripped my hand away and stumbled from the clearing, running without direction, but certain that if I stayed 1 second longer, I would never leave at all. By the time October 23rd arrived, I had lost all sense of time, each hour bleeding into the next as I staggered through the endless forest, half expecting every turn to deliver me back to that carved tree. And though I could not explain how my body kept moving, my mind was locked between panic and a strange calm, as if part of me had already surrendered to the mountains. Well, the fog lifted slightly by midday, and I stumbled upon a narrow trail that looked more defined than any I had seen in days. Its dirt packed down by recent use, though I had not seen another hiker since the start. I followed it with trembling hope, and after an hour, I emerged onto an overlook that I recognized instantly from the map. It was the very first ridge I had crossed on October 15th, which meant somehow, after days of wandering in impossible loops, I had returned to the beginning. My knees buckled in relief, and I laughed bitterly, though the sound of it seemed swallowed by the air. I forced myself down the trail, and by dusk, I reached the parking lot at the trailhead, my car still sitting there, dew-speckled but untouched, as if no time had passed at all. And for a long moment, I simply stared, convinced it might vanish the second I touched it. When it did not, I drove, without stopping, back toward Asheville, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened, and every curve of the mountain road seemed alive, watching me the way the forest had watched me in those fog-drenched nights. When I reached the city lights, relief washed over me, but so did a heavier knowledge, one that no comfort could erase, because what I had seen was not illusion or exhaustion. It was something the land itself revealed, and I knew it would never leave me. I returned to the diner the next morning, October 24th, and Henry was there in the same booth. As though waiting, I slid into the seat across from him, and before I spoke a word, he looked at me with tired eyes and said, "You saw them, didn't you?" And I could not answer, only nod, and he sighed like a man carrying a weight too long. He told me the mountains take notice of certain people, not everyone, only those who wander in with something unfinished in their hearts. And once they take notice, you are written into them forever. He said the names on the tree were real people, every one, and that some never came back, while others lived on, carrying the memory like a shadow they could never escape. I asked him about his own name carved there from 1979, and he only shook his head, saying that was the year he went missing for 3 days. And when he came back, no one believed his story except those who had their own scars from the Blue Ridge. I left the diner shaken more by the certainty in his voice than by the memory of the fog. And for weeks afterward, I told no one, not my friends, not my family. It felt too heavy, too fragile to put into words. But in quiet moments when sleep refused me, I would see the spirals glowing faintly in the dirt and hear the low hum vibrating in my bones. Months later, when I developed the photos from my trip, one image stood out, the shot of the spiral I had taken outside my tent that should have been only a gray blur, but now printed clearly revealed not one spiral, but many overlapping, stretching outward in a pattern I did not remember seeing. And at the very edge of the frame, a faint outline of a figure, tall and indistinct, standing perfectly still. My hands shook as I held the photo, and I realized the mountains had given me proof, not to convince anyone else, but to remind me that what happened was real. I keep that photo locked away, and I rarely speak of it. Yet sometimes when autumn comes and the mist hangs low over the valleys, I hear the faint chant again, not outside, but inside, like the echo of something I once survived. And in those moments, I understand what Henry meant when he said the land remembers, because the Blue Ridge has written me into its story, and no matter how many years pass, I know that story is not finished.